We tend to forget that the higher returning assets tend to be much less accessible, right? Real estate, you need a fairly large down deposit. You need a good credit score to get a mortgage. You typically need a very high income. Access to private equity, venture capital typically requires, a six figure in US dollar terms, entry tickets at the very, very least. And even getting access to stocks, requires a brokerage account and a certain level of credit to kind of typically get into that. So for the poorer people that don't have access to those asset classes, they can have access to Bitcoin and achieve returns over a long period of time, over 4-year averages that are better than anything else out there.
I'm excited to welcome Ted Paulus to the podcast. Ted is a Bitcoin advocate and macroeconomic and philosophy enthusiast. Welcome to the Bitcoin Edge, Ted.
Hi, Paula. Glad to be here with you today.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to chatting with you. Before we get to Bitcoin, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm a Canadian originally. I studied chemical engineering and worked in the Canadian energy sector for about 5 years after my studies, and then came to Europe about 12 and a half years ago, initially just on a sabbatical. It was always a kind of dream of mine to work and live internationally, and had the opportunity to do so after kind of saving up some money. So I came to Europe and just with my bicycle to the cheapest destination I could find, which happened to take me to northern Italy, and spent the next few months cycling self-supported around Central Europe, and found myself in Berlin and fell in love immediately. Decided to stay in the city for a period of time for the rest of my sabbatical. Got myself a visa and an apartment, and that was in 2012. In the late summer of 2012, I stayed there for a year and a half. That was coincidentally the time in my life when I first discovered Bitcoin and first bought my first Bitcoin. But I've been living now in Europe. Subsequently, did an MBA. Worked as a management consultant in Scandinavia, initially in Oslo, and then later here in Copenhagen. And I've also worked in then corporate strategy in the energy sector, as well as in the crypto brokerage space in Vienna for a period of time. Now I'm focused on sustainability consulting, but increasingly spending a lot more time kind of following my passion for Bitcoin, and really excited about kind of where the world's going here in this next wave with regards to Bitcoin, and wanting to get more involved, spending more of my time focusing on this space personally.
Well, you ended up in the right city. I know that Copenhagen is full of bicycles, right? It's amazing.
It really is. Yeah. I mean, I think Amsterdam might have more bicycles, but I think on a per capita basis, Copenhagen might take the cake on it. So it's a really healthy place to live in that regard. Really clean city, friendly people, everything works. A little bit rainy, but besides that, it's I really enjoy living here.
There's always trade-offs, but yeah, it sounds like a nice place. Tell us about your Bitcoin journey. You mentioned when you first got into it, did you go through an altcoin journey? And tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So I think my journey might be a little bit, I think it shares some of the common themes as I hear of most people, but also maybe some unique perspectives. So I went down the rabbit hole very quickly. I initially discovered it actually by way of the Silk Road. So I'd heard about the Silk Road for a variety of different reasons. Kind of went to the dark web and just kind of saw what it was all about, and found out that in order to purchase or do anything there, you use Bitcoin. That was the currency of the Silk Road. And, I guess on very first impression, I was like, okay, this is something used to circumvent legal systems, right? And then I don't know exactly what first got me thinking about it, but the more I kind of started researching, the more it started clicking in my head actually quite rapidly. And I think it's because the summers before that, I had gone through a phase of reading about economic history. I'd read Neil Ferguson's The Ascent of Money to kind of get a historical perspective of money. I found the book very fascinating. It was really just enlightening to get a perspective on the fact that the system we have today is not necessarily the end point. I think that was the kind of common view there that I kind of came away with. And then the historical precedents were just very, very fascinating to see how how money's been an evolution and not a destination yet. Combined with readings I'd done on Austrian economics. And I think that, the 2008 financial crisis had happened just a few years prior, and there's a lot of debate about the current financial system and the ethical and moral nature of the solutions that have been used to kind of paper it over and to bail out the banks. And I think this was the inclinations I had in my mind and also my gut, knowing that the system appeared to be inherently flawed. So I think that was coupled with then discovering Bitcoin. And there were a few influencers at that time. I think most notably, I was reading John Matonis on Twitter, as well as listening to Max Kaiser, who had a program on RT at the time. And, he's now almost exclusively talking about Bitcoin. At that time, it was maybe 10, 15% about Bitcoin and more about, I think he was still a bit of a gold bug, had a lot of gold bugs on his show, as well as just politics in general. So those were the primary influencers. I went to a few meetups, but didn't really end up really connecting with people at that time. It was really, I think, the very front end of early adopters, and I don't think I really fit the mold. I wasn't a super tech guy, and there were at least the people I met in Berlin were not. There was a few libertarians that were maybe a little too far on the spectrum for me. But it was kind of interesting to go to a few meetups nonetheless. Then when I went to do my MBA the next year in 2013, 2014, I started a Bitcoin club with one other student in the MBA program. He was also Canadian, coincidentally, and he kind of came at Bitcoin from the mining angle. So he had done some mining at home, and he and I put together a few information sessions trying to just kind of inform and educate people in our MBA class about Bitcoin. I don't think we ended up convincing anybody. There's people that showed up, but highly skeptical. And, we were kind of open to get people to kind of join the club and come up with ideas. And ultimately, nobody did. And then at the same time during that year, while I was studying, the Mt. Gox hack happened. And I did foolishly have my Bitcoin on Mt. Gox at the time. So I was in this awkward situation where I had been kind of an evangelist for this Bitcoin thing, and then also had now egg on my face for having had my Bitcoin effectively stolen. So I decided, instead of kind of going down a Bitcoin type career path at that time, instead went down a more traditional career path and actually stayed out of Bitcoin for most of the next 3 years. I was on the sidelines, just kind of watching it, following the Mt. Gox case a little bit, watching the price occasionally, but I'd been kind of turned off it and been burnt a bit much. Then in 2017, some colleagues of mine had quit their job and had gone into the ICO boom and the altcoin space. And that's where I started getting some exposure to altcoins and started dabbling a little bit at that time. Nothing too major. I was still buying. I started buying Bitcoin again in 2017, 18, just a little bit. And since then, my conviction has just been gradually growing. In 2020, 2021, I ended up, I decided I wanted to really work in the space. So I quit my job. I had connections at a place called Bitpanda in Vienna, and ended up working in the strategy team there in Vienna. And I guess the interesting thing about that role was that it was interesting to see how few people, even though they're working in a crypto brokerage where their biggest bestseller was Bitcoin. I mean, that was always the biggest driver of revenue, unsurprisingly, because it makes up the biggest market cap. But very few people were, as I would call them, Bitcoiners. I think for many of these people, it was just another job that just happened to be in the crypto space. And then of the people that were really deep into it, the vast majority of them were really into altcoins, right? They each had their favorite layer one. Some people were really ETH fans, some were Solana fans, some were Avalanche fans. So it wasn't really, I was a bit surprised, because I kind of, part of the draw to go there was really the Bitcoin ethos, if you will. And I didn't really find it there, surprisingly. Then in the most recent downturn, there was the kind of market crash. The company had to downsize. And I also had my first child born here in Copenhagen. So I needed to kind of leave Vienna, came back here, and have since been back into a bit more conventional career. But my conviction level towards Bitcoin has only gotten stronger and stronger. And now I wouldn't consider myself an absolute maxi. I still dabble a little bit into some altcoins. I'd say of my crypto portfolio, 90% is Bitcoin and 10% is other stuff. But I do recognize that other stuff is really more or less gambling, and anything that it does have superior returns over Bitcoin will only be temporary in nature. So I kind of recognize that, and recognize that none of these alternative, like other tokens, are really competitors to Bitcoin in the sense of actually becoming a real sound money and a foundation of the new monetary system. They are other applications providing other potential utilities to people. And I think that's okay. I think in the future, blockchain technology will have applications besides only Bitcoin. And I think that's totally fair.
And you think that even though you have said that you believe Bitcoin will be the main monetary system, you think that there will be a side rail for some of these other coins?
I believe so. So I think there's things that can be done. And again, this is just my own perspective as informed or uninformed as it is, but I don't think everything will be built on Bitcoin. I do think there's going to be applications for blockchain technology that will be built on different layer ones. I could imagine governance systems being built on different layer ones. I think also, like, let's look at the worst of the worst, right? Meme coins. I don't think meme coins are going away. I think they're part of our culture. They're part of the reality we live in now. The genie's out of the bottle, and I think they're going to persist for some time. You can argue whether or not they provide real value to humanity, but I think it's the same argument on whether gambling provides value or watching frivolous television provides value to humanity. I think this is just something that is going to be there, and I think there's human culture beyond monetary and financial systems. And I think there will be applications there for things that will be on blockchain, but not on Bitcoin. And that's just one example. I think there's going to be a lot of innovation in this space. And I don't, hate on people for speculating on that or spending time developing that.
Absolutely. I find it a fascinating discussion just because, I've interviewed Jeff Booth, and Jeff Booth says Bitcoin is a new protocol. Everything on the fiat system will go to zero. And that to me is a long way off, but I know Jeff's a smart guy, and maybe some of the altcoins will find a way to work in the Bitcoin rails. And I know fiat's not going away anytime soon. So we got a while with this, but it's just interesting to discuss.
Certainly. Yeah. And I guess that's an interesting question is, can you have these blockchain applications on, are they, in my mind, it's not necessarily that they exist on Bitcoin rails or on fiat rails. I see them as potentially being agnostic or being something potentially even separate to a monetary system altogether. But again, time will, I suppose, tell. And again, I don't necessarily say that if the perspective is making the best asymmetric bet of our time, it wouldn't be on anything besides Bitcoin.
Yeah, I agree. So today is a big day. We have a new US president taking office. And lots of things, expectations going on with that. How do you see things going?
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited to watch what he does on the day one in terms of executive orders. I think Trump is a disruptive force, and some people use that as a derogatory term towards him, and see it as a negative, and other people see it as a very positive thing. I think ultimately our world needs disruption right now. I think there are significant problems in this world that can be addressed. And we need to be shaken loose from a bit of our sleepwalking that we've been in for the past several decades. I would agree with his view on ending wokeism, censorship, focusing on freedom. I believe these are the foundations for human flourishing. His approach is probably one that doesn't resonate well with the vast majority of people. And it is definitely an American first perspective, right? And I think all other people in other nation states aren't necessarily there's going to be trade-offs. Not all things that are good for the US are good for their allies or for their adversaries. So I think it is a turning point, and I think much more so than Trump 1.0 potentially was. But overall, I think I'm optimistic that this is kind of what the world needs. And I think there's a potential that Canada suffers immensely economically. He's been talking about using economic force to subjugate Canada. And I think that is definitely a possibility, right? I don't think it's that far flung, but maybe ultimately it's kind of what Canada might actually need to a certain extent. I actually don't think we'd be any worse off. We've had terrible politicians for a very long period of time.
What do you think about his meme coin? I know a lot of Bitcoiners have had a little issue with that. What do you think?
My perspective is I don't see anything inherently wrong with it. I don't see it's mutually exclusive to Bitcoin. And if anything, I think there can be some advantages. I think Trump has a very large base of support within the US. I think a large number of these people have not yet gotten exposure to crypto or to Bitcoin. And I think even though his coin was built on Solana and people don't necessarily need to touch Bitcoin to get access to his coin, I think people will get exposure to understanding how a decentralized wallet functions, get access to understanding crypto, how it has value. And I think all these things are in some ways gateways into Bitcoin. I think a lot of people only discover Bitcoin after they've been burnt on some shit coins. And I think a large fraction of people will go through that journey. Some will get burnt and get turned off and not touch it for a while. And others might only discover Bitcoin through a longer road. But overall, I think it's good. I think it's good for Bitcoin. And I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think meme coins are going away. I think we have to live with them, whether you like it or not. And I don't necessarily, again, I don't see it as competition with Bitcoin. Yeah. I mean, I bought a couple of Trump coins just for fun. Why not?
It's all within at 10% of your portfolio, it's a little bit of fun and gambling. And what do you think about the strategic reserve? Because that's obviously going to be the big one.
Totally agree. That's where I think the real news is, right? I also put some money on Polygon. I think it will happen in the first 100 days. I don't know if it's happening on day one, but I think given them all the momentum we've seen at the state level, we now have, I think, 9 or 10, I believe it's 10 now, states with proposed legislation in place to make their own Bitcoin reserves. I think we also are quite aware that there's other nation states that are not democracies that are most likely already front running the US. And I just don't know how long they'll allow that to go on for, especially as if the price continues to rise month over month. So I think they have a strong rationale and impetus to be first movers in a big way. I think the bigger question is going to be, how do they finance it? I think that's going to be the hardest dilemma to figure out, right? I don't see them going to the extreme case of just turning the money printer on full force to finance it, because that would cause chaos in the traditional system, right? I don't think they can send that signal, even though that might be the way to accumulate the most at the fastest rate. But I think that's an approach that the US will not want to make as the starting move. I could understand the low hanging fruit is that they mark up the gold they currently have on the value of their balance sheet and sell the difference so that the value of the gold reserve stays the same, but they can also use a portion of that to buy Bitcoin. And then potentially selling even more gold. I like the Michael Saylor strategy to kind of screw over, if you do want to penalize or punish your biggest adversaries, you dump gold on the market, because that's what they're holding. They're not holding Bitcoin at the same levels as the US. And they buy the Bitcoin, they get further ahead. And there's been no way that anybody else can catch up to them. But I guess at one point, if it gets to the point where other countries that do have central banks that can withstand and currencies that can withstand a huge amount of inflation, that decide, China, for example, we're going to go hit the red button, hit the nuclear button, if you will, in this context, to run their money printers, then the US might need to go into a position to do something similar. But again, I think these are all things that are being calculated. And I imagine there's people in the government right now that are aware of the game theory and are positioning themselves in a way that balances ensuring the US stays ahead without causing chaos in their existing financial system, or minimizing the risk of that at least.
It's going to be very interesting to watch. The game theory is really kicking off now.
Certainly. Yeah. I think it's very, very fascinating. It's really, really exciting.
And you write some wonderful articles on your X account. You've mentioned the gold standard, how things crumbled under the gold standard. So that would be an interesting approach to sell some of the gold rather than print money. What's your thoughts?
Yeah. I don't think there's any way we're going back to gold. I think the only way gold becomes money, a functional money again, is if we go into a post-apocalyptic world where the internet's entirely shut down and we don't have the power to run anything. There's no internet, you can't use Bitcoin. Then we might go back to gold. I think that's a very, very low likelihood scenario, and one in which I don't even know if I want to be living in that scenario anyhow, let alone worrying about how to transact value, right? So I think it's very, very low likelihood that gold becomes the future. So I'd say, why not? Why not dump gold on the market and get Bitcoin? I think the only negative aspect is that there can be a backlash from the Peter Schiffs of the world and people that he can convince that say it's a foolish idea, who would be proven wrong in retrospect down the road in any case. So there is some political palatability issues and getting kind of political buy-in, but from a kind of pure technical standpoint, I don't see any issue with it. As much as we as like many Bitcoiners, I think we see the value in gold. We understand how much better the world was under a gold standard than under fiat. But the reality is we're not going backwards.
Yeah, it's a digital world now, and we've got Bitcoin. Your pinned tweet is Bitcoin Beyond Borders at the moment. Tell us a little bit more about that. I love that, Bitcoin Beyond Borders.
Yeah, so this article is really about understanding how nation states, I think we're going to see less things blur. The nation state system itself will probably become less relevant as governments' relative power vis-a-vis individuals wanes, as they have less control over the money supply and everything that goes along with that, and people gain more individual sovereignty. Now, the timeline for this might be many decades, maybe even a century to kind of fully get there, but I think we're already seeing these things kind of melt these boundaries, these kind of very arbitrary political boundaries, are becoming less and less relevant as we've kind of moved towards a more globalized world. And I think the level of globalization we've done in the last 50, 60 years has been, I'd say net on net positive, but I think we're reaching the point where it is moving to more of a negative kind of situation of having two interconnected nation states, because we're starting to see that they have their own interests and so forth, right? So I think the negative effects manifests from the disconnect between adversarial competition of nation states and the need for efficiency between individuals and companies, irrespective of which jurisdictions they land in. So ultimately, I think these are things that are good for individual sovereignty, individual freedoms, and nation states will have to adapt to that new reality. I think we're going to see a situation where, and people have talked about it for a long time, even outside the view of Bitcoin, but where nation states have to act as service providers to people like they really should have been all along, right? And not their masters, right? So, and people have the more and more flexibility to kind of move where they're treated best and vote with their feet, so to speak, and not feel constrained. I think the downside to that, to a certain extent, is that there still is something to be said for national cultures and history and national stories and so forth. And that will, of course, potentially diminish if it's very transactional in nature between individuals and the nation states or the host countries they choose to spend their time in. But, I think human, national cultures are a beautiful thing. But I guess just like anything, nothing really lasts forever, right? I think they're also, the nation state itself is something that's only a few hundred years old to begin with, right? So I think we have to kind of always be willing to have some level of creative destruction also at the kind of social and cultural level, and kind of holding on and clinging to something for too long also prevents ultimate human flourishing in some ways.
The US has the reserve currency at the moment, and they're going to hold on to that. They're going to want to hold on to that. So even though they are open to Bitcoin, which is wonderful, I've spoken to many people who say that the Federal Reserve is really the entity that runs things, central banks, and the people at the top are going to want to hold on to this power because that's made them very wealthy. How do you see that playing out?
Well, I don't think they have a choice. I think that's just unfortunately, the game theory is that I think what they can do, the US is in a position to prolong its power, whether it be whether you see it as the politicians or the central bankers. I mean, I'm more aligned with the view of Jeff Booth. And again, as uninformed as I might be, I don't think there is a they. I think it's only us. I think it's the incentive structures we elect to choose with the system that we've self-imposed on ourselves. So I don't think there's any nefarious Illuminati or central bankers pulling strings behind the scene. I think there's simply just an incentive structure that politicians can exploit and are incentivized to continue exploiting, given the coupling between the current political system we have that enables them to be in power and the monetary system that they can abuse. That also gives, I think it's especially insidious, is that abuse of the power gives the electorate the feeling in the short term that they're getting handouts or welfare or free things from the state, but actually it's at the expense of the long term. So with that said, I think the US government will want to maintain the reserve currency for as long as possible to continue to exert the geopolitical influence that it does, and as well all of the, let's say, quite exploitative elements that go along with that. When everybody else has to own US dollars in the world because they're trading in it and they're accumulating it in their reserves, that becomes a source by which they can not only suck value from their own electorate who holds the currency, but also suck future value from people all over the world. So what I don't know if it's how well it's understood at the top echelon of the US government is the fact that is the end game will be that they have to give that up, right? I think they can understand the short to medium term in which they back their own fiat currency with Bitcoin to outlast all the other fiat currencies. But I don't think they recognize that ultimately people will go straight to the Bitcoin then. They won't want to hold the intermediary currency, which can be exploited. And I don't think you can control everybody to have to use it. So yeah, I think it's going to be short to medium term US dollar wins, relatively speaking, to all fiat. But in doing so is co-opted by Bitcoin, upon which it is going to be backed by.
So what I'm understanding is you see the US dollar existing alongside Bitcoin for a while and possibly being backed by Bitcoin one day, and then Bitcoin will take over as the main monetary system.
That's my view, and I think the Bitcoin backed dollar might happen quite soon. I think. Although I see them, it's hard to know exactly how it's going to play out because I think they're doing two things in parallel. I get the sense I think they're on the one hand they're getting the strategic Bitcoin reserve and building that up, assuming they do end up doing that relatively soon. And on the other hand, they're really exploring the stable coins, which are built on USDC, which is Ethereum or other blockchains, which I think makes complete sense versus building their own CBDC, which doesn't make any sense to do something super centralized. You might as well build on something that is already out there. So it's a huge advantage the US states has that the free market has already built them their own sort of CBDC. But then, yeah, I think at one point it'll be that I think, again, when governments start saying the fiat currency system itself is collapsing, the only way we can kind of maintain our influence and geopolitical power is through acquiring Bitcoin and backing and only making our fiat currency survive by being backed by Bitcoin. That will be the next logical step, is that they're going to have to move to that. And I don't know if there's going to be some bridges they can maybe do between their existing stable coins and Bitcoin. There's lots of potential technical solutions, but that's kind of beyond my kind of wheelhouse a little bit.
If for any reason we didn't get a strategic reserve, do you see it really affecting the cycle and big downturn, or Bitcoin's going to go forward no matter what?
I think Bitcoin goes forward no matter what. It might slow down. I think the SBR is not priced in yet because so many nation states will respond, and that response will be, I think, quite massive, right, in terms of demand. So I think, and again, I haven't built any models or anything, right, so I can't really know exactly what prices I could expect it to go to. But I think the SBR puts us up into the hundreds of thousands, not just by the US being a buyer in the market, by the impact of many other nation states needing to play the same game. Now, if there isn't one, I don't see it. I think there might be a short-term correction because there might be some negative sentiment there, but I think it'll be very, very short-term. And then I think you have all the other sources of demand. You have the ETFs, you have corporates, you have countries that are going to do their own SBRs regardless of what the US does. You have the states. And I think all those sources of demand way outstrip the supply coming onto the market from the miners.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good point. In one of your articles, you mentioned in Venezuela, Lebanon, and Zimbabwe, and I happen to be in Zimbabwe, Bitcoin isn't a speculative play, it's a lifeboat money. Central banks promised prosperity, but delivered flaming piles of fiat. Bitcoin let people escape hyperinflation, sidestep capital controls, and troll their governments with every untraceable transaction. So you obviously thinking about the rest of the world. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts there.
Yeah, well, I think it's if you zoom out and try to be objective and you just set yourself outside of any given country, it's so much easier to see that it's all a spectrum, right? And I feel like there's most time you talk to Americans, they don't see it as a spectrum. They see it as, okay, there's type A and type B. We have a good currency. There's other countries that have bad currencies, right? And I don't see it that way. I see it as everybody's on the spectrum. The US is the least shitty currency, and it all goes there. And the direction of travel is they all get worse, right? And it's just which one is getting worse, slower or faster than the others. And that's the reality we're in when everything's just floating. Currencies are floating against one another. They're not tied to anything physical. And that's the game you play, is that, you just have to be the cleanest dirty shirt in the hamper to be relatively better off. And that's kind of how humans are as well. I think humans are creatures of relative comparison. You feel wealthy if you're doing better than your neighbors. So I think we don't really have and I think Jeff talks about this too, we don't have a ability to conceive of what the actual human potential could be under a real sound money and true free market. I think we're starting to see glimpses in El Salvador. After only a few years, they've already managed to change their society around in such profound ways. That being said, of course, it's a small, tiny country, so things are obviously not going to necessarily happen the same way in bigger, more complex societies. But you're seeing, some glimpses of what's possible. So I think I'm very optimistic of where this will go. But you can certainly see that the current system is one that tends towards worse and worse, less and less stable currencies, and it has such profoundly negative implications on the societies within those places. I mean, maybe you can speak to Zimbabwe and how, such high inflation rates change the ways in which people think about savings and investment and commerce and maybe other things like crime and so forth. I mean, maybe you have some perspectives on what life is like in Zimbabwe. I'd like to hear about that.
It's interesting. I always think of Bitcoin is a much fairer way to live. And you
Mm.
mentioned that it is going to be better for the rest of the world because the people closest to the money printer tend to benefit the most. And by us benefiting, sometimes that means other people lose. And so
Mm.
many of us Bitcoiners want everyone to win. The problem in Zimbabwe and Venezuela and probably Lebanon too is that many of the people who need Bitcoin the most cannot get it because they make so little money. So they have to find a way to get ahead somehow. They still have to find a way to make more money. And yes, then if they can get some money into Bitcoin, it's going to greatly benefit them. But
Mm.
that's just one of the small issues I see for the people on the lower end of the spectrum. As far as other people there, in Zimbabwe, we use the US dollar. So that does help. But most of the country is quite poor and does not make a lot of money. So that's an issue
Mm.
for them. But overall, I still see Bitcoin as just being a fairer, like all of the things that you have mentioned about, decentralized and nobody controlling. But just getting into it is part of the challenge for some people.
Yeah, that I can imagine. And I guess no matter where people are in the world or in their economic health of their own life, it ultimately does still pretty necessitate the ability to earn more than you spend in a way that is not detrimental to your health or well-being, I suppose, right? But as long as people can, at that very minimum, earn more than they spend, provide more value to others at a fair price, and then be able to store the savings in a vehicle that will continue to over the coming years be the best performing asset on a risk adjusted basis. I think that's going to be good, and I think the cool thing is that theoretically, at least, anybody who has an internet connection can access this. I think we tend to forget that the higher returning assets tend to be much less accessible, right? Real estate, you need a fairly large down deposit. You need a good credit score to get a mortgage. You typically need a very high income. Access to private equity, venture capital typically requires a six figure in US dollar terms entry tickets at the very least, and even getting access to stocks requires a brokerage account and a certain level of credit to kind of typically get into that. So for the poorer people that don't have access to those asset classes, they can have access to Bitcoin and achieve returns over a long period of time, over 4-year averages that are better than anything else out there. So in that case, I do think it is very fair. But it's not always perceived to be the case, right? There's a lot of things that make people perceive that Bitcoin is exclusive, and I think that's unfortunate. And I think it's an interesting phenomenon. Right? I have friends that I try to talk to Bitcoin about who are also, they're economists. I like to get their perspectives on how they see Bitcoin and so forth. And several of them say, I bring up the strategic Bitcoin reserve. They say, oh yeah, that's only good for the people that have Bitcoin. They see it as being like it's a specific subset of the population that benefits and other people don't benefit. And I think they tend to lose that perspective that could also be you. There's nothing stopping you from also benefiting. All you have to do is kind of just get on board and get some, right? But I think a lot of people, for whatever reason, want to see it as an us-them situation. And therefore, all their entire lenses are within that kind of confine of seeing any public policy that is positive for Bitcoin as being something that is only being done because there's been some political influence from external organizations that are trying to get things that are only good for them. And I don't think that characterizes well the typical Bitcoin culture.
You made some really good points there, and I love the part about spending less than you earn. That's key. We often hear Bitcoin fixes everything. It doesn't fix everything. You've got to be willing and you've got to be ready for Bitcoin. But when you are ready, it is the better way. How's adoption in Denmark?
I don't have any specific numbers, but I think it's lower than the European average, and I think it's significantly lower than the global average. I think I've talked about this to a few other podcasters, but I think because they have it's not as recognizable, the cost of living challenges, I think there's less receptivity towards it. And I think there's also a strong degree of conformity and trust in the media. And right now the media has pretty negative sentiments towards it, or I would say whereas the media in the United States and other countries has become less negative, I think Denmark has kind of been staying where they are. They have even announced taxing crypto unrealized gains made on crypto, which would be extra punitive on it, which they wouldn't do with any other asset class. And I think it's a little bit antithetical for the time being in terms of what they want to encourage their people to do, which happens in lots of countries, including Canada, where they want to drive people towards putting their savings into real estate. Because I think there's also just incentives for governments to get more property tax if property values go up. You can kind of drive more into your financial sector. You can drive the construction sector more. You can kind of get a big GDP boost by getting people to put money into real estate, which you don't get if people just put their money into Bitcoin. So, but what you do see here in Denmark is increasingly this kind of unaffordability of real estate and homes in at least cities, right? So that is one area where you really do see this conflict of interest, let's say, or balancing act the governments have to navigate between, keeping people feeling like they're getting wealthier through the investments they make and the savings they earn, keeping up with inflation, and the mechanism they enable them to do that is through real estate, but then gradually pricing the next generation out of the market as their wages aren't able to keep up with inflation typically. So again, it's not as profound or marked as in many other countries, also because their debt to GDP ratio is quite low relative to other countries, but it is starting to become obvious here too. And again, I do think Denmark might get a different perspective once things like the US Strategic Bitcoin Reserve take place and other countries start moving. I think they will also, just like many other countries, have to make a move as well.
I love that you brought up earlier, we are all one. Do you think there's a spiritual side to Bitcoin?
I don't know about spiritual per se. I would say moral. I think there's a moral aspect to it. I do think there is having monies moored to something real, in this case, the proof of work through the Bitcoin network, will create a more just society, more fair and equitable, and one in which there is a greater degree of mutual cooperation, collaboration, and less conflict. And I think also less ability for governments to finance conflicts against one another. So I think there is a moral aspect, not necessarily spiritual. I have my own spiritual perspectives, but I don't think they're relatively independent of Bitcoin.
Okay. Last question. I love your art. Very cool. So how has Bitcoin changed you?
Yeah, I think for me, it's I've never really felt like I'm a bit of a lone wolf. I like to do my own thing. Haven't really felt comfortable in being a fan of a specific team or a specific political party. I try to stay float between wherever it kind of makes sense and not feeling like getting too into any sort of cult type of groupthink. But when it comes to Bitcoin, it is the first time in my life where I've kind of been like, okay, Bitcoiners in general are kind of like my crew, my tribe that I can kind of get along with. So it is like the one community in my life that I've kind of felt that it's worth really becoming a part of, because I think it is something that is going to have I think first of all, it's very, very interesting, and everybody has different perspectives that are interesting to share and debate. But then also what we share in common is this view that this is ultimately going to have profoundly positive and optimistic implications on the world. And it's something that I think we all play a part in driving forward. So I think that's the aspect that it's had to change me personally.
I like that. It brings us together because we have that in common. I spoke to Petri and Bjorn from Finland and Norway. My goal was to speak to someone from every country, but it's just amazing how much we have in common just around Bitcoin. And that's where I just try to keep the focus. So tell us where people can find you.
Sure thing. Yeah. So I'm fairly active on X. I try to post an article on X daily. My handle is Ruxpin, or RUXPIN 84, and I'm sure you'll put that in the comments of the video when you post it. So feel free to follow me and reach out if you want to collaborate or have a discussion, have an interview. I'm happy to meet other Bitcoiners and find some ways to work together.
and maybe start a meetup in Denmark.
Yeah, if you're in Denmark, I mean, one guy reached out to me recently, actually, and we met up for a beer on Friday. He saw my interview with Robin Sayre and just reached out. So I'm always up for meeting people in the flesh as well.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Paula. It's been a pleasure.